Family Guy has been on the air for over 25 years, been cancelled twice, brought back from the dead by DVD sales, and somehow outlasted almost every show that tried to compete with it. From secret auditions and near-death experiences to banned episodes and billion-dollar lawsuits, the story behind this show is wilder than anything Peter Griffin has ever done on screen. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's go through everything you never knew about Family Guy. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of how Family Guy came to exist is one of the most unlikely origin stories in television history. It all starts with a kid from Connecticut who could draw before he could properly talk. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut, and by the age of 2, he had already picked up a pencil and started sketching. That might sound like exaggeration, but the guy was genuinely drawing recognizable figures before most kids can hold a crayon properly. By the time he was 5, he knew he wanted to be an animator. And by 8 years old, he had his first comic strip published in a local Connecticut newspaper called the Kent Dispatch. The strip was called Walter Crouton, and while it wasn't exactly groundbreaking stuff, the fact that an 8-year-old was getting published in any newspaper at all tells you something about where this kid was headed. MacFarlane grew up in a time when animation was experiencing a massive renaissance. Disney was pumping out classics like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, and those films became his initial dream. He wanted to work for Disney. He wanted to be one of those animators bringing fairy tales to life on the big screen. That was the plan, and for a while, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable career path for someone with his talent. But then something happened that completely changed the trajectory of his life. The Simpsons premiered in 1989, and suddenly MacFarlane realized there was this entirely different world of animation that he had never considered. Here was a show that was animated, but it wasn't for kids. It was sharp, it was funny, it was satirical, and it was aimed squarely at adults. MacFarlane later described the moment as a revelation, saying that The Simpsons essentially rewrote the rule book for what you could do on television with animation. The Disney dream quietly faded into the background, replaced by something much more ambitious. MacFarlane enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. While there, he studied animation and film, and it was during his time at RISD that the seeds of Family Guy were first planted. As part of his coursework, MacFarlane created an animated short film called The Life of Larry. The short centered around a middle-aged man named Larry and his anthropomorphic dog, Steve. If that sounds familiar, it should, because Larry would eventually become Peter Griffin, and Steve would become Brian Griffin. The short was crude by professional standards, but it showed flashes of the humor and irreverence that would later define Family Guy. The characters were rough sketches of what they would become, but the DNA was already there. A bumbling everyman and his talking dog navigating the absurdities of everyday life. The Life of Larry caught the attention of some important people. Specifically, it caught the eye of executives at Hanna-Barbera Studios, which at the time was still one of the biggest names in animation. 2 weeks before MacFarlane even graduated from RISD, Hanna-Barbera offered him a job in Los Angeles. Just like that, the kid from Connecticut was packing his bags and heading to Hollywood. At Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane cut his teeth working on shows that pretty much every 90s kid would recognize. He contributed to Johnny Bravo, Dexter's Laboratory, and Cow and Chicken, among others. These weren't his projects, but they gave him invaluable experience in the nuts and bolts of professional animation production. He learned how a writer's room functioned, how episodes moved from script to storyboard to finished product, and how to work within the constraints of network television. While working at Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane continued developing his own ideas. He created a follow-up to The Life of Larry called Larry and Steve, which refined the concept further and polished the humor. This second short was what really opened doors for him. When executives at 20th Century Fox saw it, they were intrigued enough to ask MacFarlane to develop something for them. Now, here's where things get interesting. Fox's initial idea wasn't what you might expect. The original plan was for MacFarlane's work to appear as animated inserts on the sketch comedy show MAD-TV. Think of how The Simpsons started as short segments on the Tracey Ullman Show before getting its own series. That was basically the blueprint. MacFarlane would create short animated bits that would air during MAD-TV episodes, and if they caught on, maybe something bigger would come of it. But there was a problem. MAD's budget wasn't big enough to support the kind of animation MacFarlane wanted to produce. The show just didn't have the financial resources to bring his vision to life properly. So the MAD-TV plan fell through, and MacFarlane was left with a concept but no home for it. That could have been the end of the story. A lot of creative projects die at exactly this stage, killed by budget constraints and network indifference. But MacFarlane wasn't ready to give up. He decided to pitch the concept directly to Fox as a standalone series. The timing of this pitch is important because it overlapped with another significant moment in Fox animation history. MacFarlane first brought his concept to Fox right around the same time that Mike Judge was pitching King of the Hill. Fox was hesitant to take on another animated comedy, especially one that was so different from the wholesome suburban satire that King of the Hill represented. They passed on MacFarlane's pitch and went with King of the Hill instead. But when King of the Hill became a hit, it changed the calculation. Fox realized there was an appetite for animated comedy on their network beyond just The Simpsons, and suddenly that idea they had passed on started looking a lot more attractive. A year after being rejected, MacFarlane got another shot. Fox gave him $50,000 to create a pilot, which by network television standards is practically pocket change. Most pilots cost millions to produce, so MacFarlane was working with a fraction of what most creators get. But he made it work. Using that modest budget, he hand-animated a 7-minute presentation at his kitchen table that would serve as the proof of concept for the series. When Fox executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden saw the finished product, they were impressed enough to order 13 episodes. Family Guy was officially greenlit. The show premiered on January 31, 1999, and the timing of that premiere was no accident. Fox scheduled it to air immediately after Super Bowl 33, which was one of the most watched television events of the year. The idea was to give the show maximum exposure right out of the gate, introducing it to the largest possible audience in one shot. Millions of people who had just watched the Denver Broncos beat the Atlanta Falcons stuck around to see what this new cartoon was all about. It was an aggressive launch strategy, and it worked in the sense that it got people talking. The rest of the first season began airing in April of that year, and Family Guy was officially part of the television landscape. But those early days were anything but smooth. The show drew attention, both positive and negative, from the very first episode. Critics were divided. Some saw it as a fresh, edgy take on the animated sitcom formula. Others dismissed it as a crude knockoff of The Simpsons with an over-reliance on shock humor and pop culture references. The comparisons to The Simpsons were immediate and relentless, and they would follow Family Guy for its entire existence. MacFarlane has always been upfront about The Simpsons' influence on his work, calling it one of the greatest comedy shows of all time in its prime. But he's also pushed back against the idea that Family Guy is simply a Simpsons clone, pointing out that Peter Griffin's voice and character were actually more inspired by Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners than by Homer Simpson. Those first 2 seasons were a constant battle for survival. Ratings fluctuated wildly, and Fox started getting nervous. The Parents Television Council, a conservative watchdog group that monitors content in television, had already put a target on the show's back. They launched a letter-writing campaign to get Family Guy cancelled, and they made the show a regular feature on their weekly worst show list. The PTC would go on to name Family Guy as the worst show of the week on over 40 separate occasions throughout the show's run, making it arguably their most frequent target in the history of the organization. MacFarlane's response to the PTC was characteristically blunt. He once compared receiving criticism from the PTC to getting hate mail from Hitler, which probably didn't do much to improve their relationship. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, Family Guy was developing a devoted fan base. The humor was hitting with a younger demographic that appreciated its willingness to go places other shows wouldn't. The cutaway gags, which would become the show's signature comedic device, were unlike anything else on television at the time. Instead of building jokes within the plot like a traditional sitcom, Family Guy would interrupt its own story to cut away to brief, tangentially related sketches that could reference anything from obscure 80s cartoons to uncomfortable social situations. These cutaways became a love-it-or-hate-it proposition. Fans thought they were hilarious and endlessly quotable. Critics thought they were lazy writing that substituted randomness for actual humor. Both sides had a point, but regardless of where you fell on the debate, the cutaway gag format made Family Guy instantly recognizable and completely distinct from everything else on television. Now, let's talk about the voices that bring Quahog to life, because the casting and voice work behind Family Guy is genuinely fascinating, and there are some stories here that most people have never heard. The most obvious place to start is with Seth MacFarlane himself, because the man is essentially a one-person voice acting studio. MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's main characters, Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire. He also provides the voices for numerous recurring characters, including news anchor Tom Tucker and Lois's father Carter Pewterschmidt. The fact that one person can produce such drastically different voices is remarkable, and watching MacFarlane record is apparently something to behold. He shifts between characters within the same recording session, sometimes within the same scene, going from Peter's thick Rhode Island accent to Stewie's clipped British diction to Brian's casual drawl without missing a beat. Each of these voices has its own origin story, and some of them are more surprising than you might think. Peter Griffin's voice, which is one of the most recognizable in all of animation, was based on a real person. Specifically, it was based on a security guard who worked at the Rhode Island School of Design while MacFarlane was a student there. MacFarlane and his friends used to crack up at the way this guy talked. He had this loud, distinctive Rhode Island accent that was almost impossible to take seriously. MacFarlane filed that voice away in his memory, and years later, when he needed a voice for his bumbling everyman character, the security guard's accent came roaring back. The result is Peter Griffin, whose voice has become so iconic that MacFarlane has essentially made the security guard's way of speaking famous without the guy ever knowing that he was the inspiration. Stewie Griffin's voice went in a completely different direction. Instead of drawing from real life, MacFarlane based Stewie's accent on the voice of English actor Rex Harrison, particularly his performance in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady. There's also an element of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons in there, which MacFarlane has acknowledged. The combination of aristocratic British elocution with the body and behavior of a 1-year-old baby is what makes Stewie such an inherently funny character. Everything he says sounds like it should be coming from a distinguished gentleman at a London club, but instead it's coming from a toddler with a football-shaped head who can barely reach the kitchen counter. MacFarlane has mentioned that if a live-action version of Family Guy were ever made, he'd want David Hyde Pierce to play Stewie, which tells you a lot about the kind of energy he sees in the character. Brian Griffin is unique among MacFarlane's characters because he doesn't use a special voice at all. Brian speaks with MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, which is something most casual viewers don't realize. When you hear Brian talking, you're hearing Seth MacFarlane as Seth MacFarlane. This was a deliberate choice, because Brian was always intended to be the most grounded and relatable member of the Griffin household. He's the voice of reason, the one who comments on the insanity around him. By using his own voice, MacFarlane essentially made Brian his avatar within the show. And the similarities go beyond just the voice. Brian's left-leaning political views, his love of literature, his occasional pretentiousness, and even his fondness for martinis all mirror aspects of MacFarlane's own personality. That said, MacFarlane doesn't give Brian any special treatment. The character is frequently the butt of jokes, and his pompous attitude and failed romantic relationships are played for laughs just as much as anyone else's flaws. Now, here's a casting fact that could have changed the entire show. William H. Macy auditioned for the role of Brian Griffin back in 1997. Let that sink in for a second. One of the most respected dramatic actors in Hollywood wanted to voice the talking dog on an animated sitcom. MacFarlane has admitted publicly that he thinks he made a bad call by not casting Macy, which is a pretty remarkable thing for a creator to say about one of his most successful characters. The reason Macy didn't get the role ultimately came down to budget constraints. Hiring a name actor would have cost more money than the shoestring production could afford, so MacFarlane decided to voice the character himself. In hindsight, it's hard to imagine Brian with any voice other than MacFarlane's, but there's an alternate universe out there where Brian Griffin sounds like William H. Macy, and honestly, that would have been pretty fascinating. The voice of Lois Griffin comes from Alex Borstein, who is an incredibly talented performer in her own right. Borstein came up through the improved and sketch comedy world, and she had a connection to MacFarlane through the entertainment industry. What most people don't know is that Borstein also voices several other characters on the show, including Asian correspondent Trisha Takanawa and Loretta Brown. Her range is impressive, though Lois's voice is probably the one that's most deeply embedded in pop culture. The voice itself has evolved over the years, becoming slightly more exaggerated as the show has leaned further into comedy. In the early seasons, Lois sounded more like a regular suburban mom. As the show progressed, there's a bit more nasal quality to the voice, a bit more character, which reflects how Lois herself has changed from a straight woman to a more active participant in the show's chaos. Then there's Meg Griffin, and the story behind her voice is one of the most well-known pieces of Family Guy trivia. For the entire first season, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabot, who at the time was best known for playing Claudia on Party of Five. Chabot voiced 15 episodes, but due to a contractual issue, she was never actually credited on screen for any of them. Starting with the second season, Mila Kunis took over the role, and she's been voicing Meg ever since. The transition happened relatively quietly, and most viewers didn't even notice the change, which speaks to how seamlessly Kunis stepped into the character. Kunis was only about 15 years old when she auditioned for the role, which means she was actually close to Meg's age, something that helped her capture the character's teenage awkwardness and frustration. Chris Griffin's voice has one of the most entertaining origin stories of any character on the show. Seth Green, who voices Chris, has said that he based the voice on an imitation of Ted Levine's character Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. Obviously, He tweaked the impression significantly to make it sound like an awkward teenage boy rather than a serial killer, but that's the foundation. The initial concept for Chris had him as more of a punk rebel character, but Green's voice lent itself better to the direction the character eventually took, which is that of a sweet but dim teenager who's essentially a younger version of his father. In a spectacular bit of self-reference, the show later had Chris reenact the infamous Silence of the Lambs scene where Buffalo Bill dances in front of a mirror, which was a direct callback to the origin of the character's voice. MacFarlane has talked about how physically demanding voice acting can be, especially when you're performing multiple characters in rapid succession. He's described being pretty abusive with his voice, and there have been times when the production machine has tried to push him into the recording booth when he's under the weather. MacFarlane has had to stand his ground on those occasions, telling the team to actually listen to how he sounds before forcing him to record. When your voice is the foundation of 4 major characters plus a rotating cast of supporting players, protecting that instrument becomes essential. One bad recording session could affect multiple characters across multiple episodes. The main cast members make anywhere from $175,000 to $225,000 per episode, which is substantial but actually less than what the cast of The Simpsons earns. For MacFarlane, of course, the real money comes from his role as creator and executive producer rather than just his voice work. His overall deal with Fox has been worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, making him one of the highest paid people in television. Let's talk about what might be the most remarkable comeback in television history, because Family Guy didn't just get cancelled once. It got cancelled twice. And somehow it clawed its way back from the dead both times. The first cancellation came after the second season, which aired between 1999 and 2000. Ratings had declined from the Super Bowl premiere highs, and Fox wasn't seeing the numbers they wanted. The network pulled the plug, and Family Guy disappeared from the airwaves. There was no farewell episode, no big announcement. The show just stopped. For most series, that would be the end of the story. Television is littered with shows that got cancelled after 2 seasons and were never heard from again. But Family Guy wasn't most shows. During the hiatus, something unexpected happened. Fox started airing reruns, and people who had missed the show the first time around started discovering it. Ratings for the reruns were surprisingly solid, which caught the attention of executives. Based on this, Fox decided to give the show another shot, bringing it back for a 3rd season. But the reprieve was short-lived. After the 3rd season finished airing in 2002, Fox cancelled Family Guy again. This time, it seemed more final. The show had been given a second chance and hadn't delivered the ratings Fox needed. The unaired episode from the 3rd season, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, didn't even make it to Fox's schedule. It eventually premiered on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block in 2003, which was technically the end of Family Guy's original run. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Fox had licensed the first 50 episodes to Cartoon Network for their Adult Swim programming block, and those reruns absolutely exploded in popularity. Adult Swim's target demographic was exactly the audience that Family Guy appealed to: young adults, college students, night owls, and people who appreciated edgy comedy. The show became one of Adult Swim's highest-rated programs, consistently pulling in massive numbers for late-night cable. At the same time, the Family Guy DVD sets were selling at an unprecedented rate. The first volume became the best-selling DVD release for a television series at the time. People who had never watched the show on Fox were buying the DVDs, binging the episodes, and becoming devoted fans. College dorm rooms across America were running Family Guy DVDs on repeat. The show's writers later joked that they had argued at the time that there weren't Nielsen boxes in either dorm rooms or prisons, and those were both big demographics for them. It was a funny line, but it pointed to something real. Family Guy had found its audience, just not through the traditional channels that networks use to measure success. The combination of explosive Adult Swim ratings and record-breaking DVD sales created something that had literally never happened before in television. Fox was now looking at hard data showing that there was a massive, enthusiastic audience for a show they had cancelled twice. The numbers were too big to ignore. In February 2004, Seth MacFarlane confirmed in an interview that Family Guy would resume production. Fox officially announced in March 2004 that they had committed to producing at least 22 new episodes. The show would return to the Fox lineup in 2005, making Family Guy the first cancelled television series to be resurrected primarily because of DVD sales. The fourth season premiere aired on May 1, 2005, and the show immediately addressed its own history with characteristic irreverence. Peter listed off a bunch of Fox shows that would have to fail before Family Guy could return, rattling off the names of short-lived series that had occupied the show's former time slot. It was a pointed reminder that Fox had chosen other programming over Family Guy and that those choices had all bombed. The message was clear: you should never have gotten rid of us in the first place. The return was a massive success. The premiere drew enormous ratings, validating Fox's decision to bring the show back. From that point forward, Family Guy became a permanent fixture of Fox's Sunday night animated lineup, airing alongside The Simpsons and eventually joined by shows like American Dad and Bob's Burgers. The show that had been cancelled twice was now one of the network's most reliable performers, averaging around 9.4 million viewers per season at its peak. What makes this comeback story so significant isn't just that it happened. It's that it fundamentally changed how the television industry thinks about cancelled shows. Before Family Guy, the idea that DVD sales and cable reruns could resurrect a dead series was practically unthinkable. Networks made their decisions based on Nielsen ratings and advertising revenue, and once a show was cancelled, it was gone. Family Guy proved that there were other metrics that mattered, that audiences could be found in places the traditional measurement systems didn't capture. Every time you see a cancelled show get picked up by a streaming service or brought back by popular demand, you can trace that lineage back to what happened with Family Guy in 2005. The financial implications were enormous as well. By 2009, it cost approximately $2 million to produce a single episode of Family Guy. But the revenue the show generated through advertising, merchandising, and home media sales dwarfed that production cost many times over. MacFarlane signed increasingly lucrative deals with Fox, eventually landing a contract worth $100 million. The show that had been killed twice was now a billion-dollar franchise. Fox would eventually announce a historic four-season renewal deal that would take Family Guy through its 27th season, securing the show on television through at least 2029. From near extinction to a guaranteed future spanning 3 decades, Family Guy's survival story is one of the most improbable in entertainment history. Now, let's talk about one of the most chilling near misses in Hollywood history, because the story of how Seth MacFarlane almost died on September 11, 2001, is the kind of thing that sounds like it was made up for dramatic effect, but it's completely, verifiably true. On the night of September 10, 2001, MacFarlane was in Rhode Island. He had gone back to his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, to give a lecture. After the lecture, he went out for drinks with some friends. Nothing unusual about that. Just a night of socializing after a work event. But that night of drinking would turn out to be the most consequential bender in modern entertainment history. MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 the next morning, scheduled to fly from Boston's Logan International Airport to Los Angeles. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time, telling him the flight left at 8:15 in the morning when it actually departed at 7:45. Between the incorrect information and the hangover from the previous night's drinking, MacFarlane overslept and arrived at the airport about 10 minutes too late. The gate had already been closed. He was told he couldn't board. So MacFarlane did what any tired, hungover traveler would do. He went to the airport lounge to rest and figure out his next move. He fell asleep. About 40 minutes later, he woke up to discover that American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked by terrorists. At 8:46 in the morning, the plane had been flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Everyone on board was killed. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, had missed that flight by 10 minutes. A hangover and a travel agent's mistake had saved his life. The margin between him being on that plane and not being on that plane was almost nothing. A few less drinks the night before, a more accurate departure time from his agent, or waking up 5 minutes earlier, and the story of Family Guy would have ended on that September morning. MacFarlane has spoken about this experience on several occasions, and his perspective on it is interesting. You might expect someone who came that close to death to have some profound spiritual awakening or to believe they were saved by fate for some higher purpose. But MacFarlane has been remarkably pragmatic about the whole thing. In an interview with Howard Stern, he said he's not much of a fate person and that he sees the whole thing as a coincidence. He's missed other flights for the same reason, and this one just happened to be the one that mattered. He acknowledged that it was rattling for the first few weeks, which is probably the understatement of the century, but said he didn't allow the experience to define him. What's also worth noting is that MacFarlane wasn't the only notable person originally booked on that flight. Mark Wahlberg was also supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11 but changed his plans at the last minute. Wahlberg later made a controversial comment suggesting that if he had been on the plane, things wouldn't have gone down the way they did, essentially implying that he could have prevented the hijacking single-handedly. He later apologized for the comment, acknowledging it was ridiculous. MacFarlane, characteristically, never made any such claims. The near miss adds a strange undercurrent to everything MacFarlane has done since that day. American Dad, which premiered in 2005, deals directly with themes of terrorism and national security through its CIA agent protagonist. Ted, MacFarlane's first feature film, became a massive box office hit. The Orville, his science fiction series, has been praised as one of the best Star Trek-style shows in years. None of it would have existed if a hungover animator had woken up 5 minutes earlier on a Tuesday morning in September 2001. It also means that the entire post-cancellation arc of Family Guy wouldn't have happened. The DVD sales, the Adult Swim phenomenon, the resurrection, the hundreds of episodes that have aired since 2005, all of it required MacFarlane to be alive to shepherd it. Without him, the show that was already cancelled would have stayed cancelled. The voices of Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire would have gone silent permanently. The cultural impact of Family Guy, for better and worse, would have stopped at around 50 episodes. There's something almost impossibly fragile about that chain of events. An entire empire of comedy, billions of dollars in revenue, thousands of hours of entertainment, and the careers of hundreds of writers, animators, and actors, all of it hanging on whether or not a guy had one too many drinks the night before. It's the kind of story that makes you think about how random and precarious life really is, regardless of whether you believe in fate or coincidence. Let's shift gears and talk about how Family Guy actually gets made, because the creative process behind the show is more complex and more interesting than most people realize. The cutaway gag format that defines Family Guy's comedic identity didn't just happen by accident. It was developed, refined, and systematically built into the show's creative DNA through a process that's unlike anything else in television. The writing process for Family Guy begins in the writer's room, which is the creative engine of the entire operation. For the first few months of production, back when the show was just getting started, the writers actually shared a single office that was lent to them by the King of the Hill production crew. They were literally borrowing space from another show just to have somewhere to work. From those humble beginnings, the writer's room has grown into a substantial operation with a full team of writers who pitch, develop, and refine every episode. The process typically starts with writers pitching ideas for episodes in the room. These pitches can be anything from fully formed storylines to vague concepts that get developed collaboratively. Once an idea is chosen, the writers begin crafting the script, which goes through several rounds of revision before it's considered finished. But what makes Family Guy's process unique is how the cutaway gags are developed. Many of the show's most memorable moments aren't part of the main plot at all. They're those brief, tangential vignettes that interrupt the story for a quick joke, and they often come from a completely separate brainstorming process. Writers will generate hundreds of cutaway ideas, far more than could ever be used in a single episode. These ideas get pitched, discussed, and sorted, with the best ones being matched to episodes where they fit thematically or where the story needs a comedic boost. Some cutaway gags are created specifically for an episode, while others are essentially jokes looking for a home that get slotted in wherever they work best. This is why the cutaways sometimes feel disconnected from the main story, because in many cases, they literally were developed independently. Table reads are a crucial part of the process. Steve Callahan, who is the most prolific writer in Family Guy history with 19 episodes to his credit, has described how important these sessions are. During table reads, the cast sits down with the script and performs it for an audience that includes people from outside the show's regular team. The idea is to bring a freshness and more objective perspective to the material, to see if outside ears find the jokes funny the same way the writers do. The goal, as Callahan has described it, is to make a show that's funny for as many people as possible. If a joke doesn't land during the table read, it gets reworked or replaced before recording. The recording process itself is where MacFarlane's incredible vocal versatility comes into play. Unlike many animated shows where actors record their lines separately, Family Guy often records its main cast together, which allows for more natural interactions and better comedic timing. MacFarlane has to juggle multiple characters within these sessions, shifting between voices with the kind of precision that comes from decades of practice. He's described being pretty hard on his voice and needing to stand his ground when the production team tries to put him in the booth when he's not feeling well. Given that he voices for main characters plus numerous supporting roles, protecting his voice is literally essential to the show's continued existence. Walter Murphy, the show's composer, creates original music for every single episode. Music has always been a huge part of Family Guy's identity, from the elaborate musical numbers that punctuate certain episodes to the subtle scoring that underlines emotional or comedic moments. Murphy's work gives the show a sonic richness that goes well beyond what most animated comedies attempt. MacFarlane himself is a talented singer with a genuine love of big band and classic crooner music, and that passion frequently bleeds into the show's musical sequences. The result is that Family Guy's musical numbers are often genuinely impressive from a production standpoint, even when the lyrics are deliberately absurd. The animation process has evolved significantly over the show's run. Early episodes were produced with relatively modest budgets and simple animation techniques. As the show's success grew, so did the production values. The Star Wars parody episodes, which we'll get to later, required a level of animation sophistication that rivaled anything else on television at the time. Modern episodes of Family Guy are produced using a combination of traditional and digital techniques, with animation work being done both domestically and overseas. An episode typically takes about 9 months to produce from initial concept to final air date, which means the writer's room is always working several episodes ahead of what viewers are currently seeing on screen. One of the most interesting aspects of Family Guy's creative process is how it handles controversy. The show has always pushed boundaries, and that means the writers are constantly navigating the line between edgy comedy and genuinely offensive content. Fox's Standards and Practices Department reviews every script, and there's an ongoing negotiation between what the writers want to include and what the network will allow on the air. MacFarlane has talked about how the network sometimes pushes back on certain jokes or storylines, and there's a constant back and forth about where the line is. Some jokes get through that probably shouldn't have, and some jokes get cut that probably would have been fine. The process is imperfect, but it's part of what keeps the show in a constant state of creative tension. The writer's room itself has produced some remarkably successful alumni. Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan, who worked on Family Guy, went on to co-write 13 episodes for NBC's Scrubs while also serving as producers on that show. Many other Family Guy writers have gone on to create or produce successful series of their own. The room functions as a kind of comedy boot camp, where writers develop their skills under intense pressure and tight deadlines, and the experience prepares them for whatever comes next in their careers. Now, let's talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of Family Guy's long run, which is how dramatically the main characters have changed over the course of 25 years. Character evolution is normal for any long-running show, but what's happened with the Griffin family goes well beyond the typical adjustments. Some of these characters are barely recognizable compared to their early incarnations, and the reasons behind those changes tell you a lot about how the show itself has evolved. Let's start with Peter Griffin, because his transformation is probably the most dramatic and the most controversial. When Family Guy first premiered, Peter was essentially a rougher, edgier version of the classic sitcom dad. He was dim and oafish, sure, but he also had a recognizable human quality to him. He held down a job, he cared about his family in his own bumbling way, and his schemes, while stupid, were at least grounded in some version of reality. He had a stronger conservative streak reminiscent of Archie Bunker from All in the Family, which made sense given that MacFarlane has cited All in the Family as one of his biggest influences. The show's opening sequence is actually a direct callback to All in the Family's iconic intro, with Peter and Lois sitting at the piano just like Archie and Edith. As the seasons progressed, Peter's character underwent what fans and critics often refer to as Flanderization, a term borrowed from The Simpsons' Ned Flanders, where a character's most exaggerated traits gradually consume their entire personality. Peter went from being a well-meaning but dim family man to being essentially a cartoon character in the most literal sense. His intelligence dropped to the point where the show's own canon established that he meets the medical and legal requirements to be classified as mentally disabled. His behavior became increasingly detached from reality, with a near Deadpool-level ability to survive impossible situations and bounce back from injuries that would kill a normal person. MacFarlane has acknowledged this shift, and the voice work reflects it. Peter's voice has gotten slightly higher pitched over the years, coinciding with his increasingly childish disposition. The effect is that early Peter sounds like a blue-collar guy with more bluster than brains, while modern Peter sounds like a large toddler who happens to have a driver's license. Whether this evolution has been good for the show depends on who you ask. Some fans appreciate how the increased absurdity has set Peter apart from other TV dads. Others feel that it's robbed the character of the grounded humanity that made him relatable and funny in the first place. Stewie Griffin has undergone arguably the most significant character overhaul on the entire show, and unlike Peter's gradual drift, Stewie's transformation was a deliberate creative decision that the writers have openly discussed. In the early seasons, Stewie was a megalomaniacal genius baby whose primary motivations were world domination and matricide. He spent his time building doomsday devices, plotting to kill his mother Lois, and speaking in the kind of refined, threatening language you'd expect from a Bond villain. He was also one of the show's most quotable characters, delivering lines that mixed aristocratic diction with casual cruelty in a way that was genuinely unique. The turning point came around the time of the direct-to-video movie Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, and the two-part episode arc Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie. In the latter, the show essentially let Stewie achieve his goals in a simulation, only to reveal that the whole thing was a computer-generated scenario. Having seen the disastrous results of his plans play out virtually, Stewie decided to put aside his ambitions for world domination and matricide, at least for the time being. From that point forward, the writers gradually shifted Stewie's character in a completely different direction. The evil genius baby became a more eccentric, flamboyant, and surprisingly vulnerable character. His friendship with Brian, which had been a minor element in the early seasons, became one of the show's central relationships. The road to episodes, in which Brian and Stewie go on various adventures together, became some of the most beloved installments in the entire series. Stewie's ambiguous sexuality also became a major source of humor, with the show exploring his identity in ways that ranged from subtle to extremely on the nose. In the episode Send In Stewie Please, he revealed to a therapist that while he considers himself heterosexual, he also sees himself as fluid and attracted to either gender at a given time. The question of whether people can actually hear Stewie has been one of the show's longest-running ambiguities. In the early seasons, most of the Griffin family seemed to ignore what Stewie was saying, which added to his frustration and isolation. As the show progressed, characters started responding to his speech more frequently, and the show has acknowledged this inconsistency as a meta-joke. It's never been definitively resolved, which is probably intentional. The ambiguity gives the writers freedom to use Stewie in whatever way serves a particular scene best. Brian Griffin's evolution might be the most frustrating to longtime fans. When Family Guy first debuted, one of its most distinctive features was having a talking dog who was the smartest, most level-headed member of the family. Brian served as an audience surrogate, commenting on the insanity around him and providing Peter with a voice of reason in times of crisis. He was witty, cultured, and sardonic, with enough flaws thrown in to keep him from being insufferably perfect, like his brief cocaine addiction during his time as a police K-9 unit. Over time, Brian's character shifted in a direction that many fans found disappointing. The joke gradually became less about the dog being the smartest guy in the room and more about Brian being a pretentious, elitist liberal who drinks too much, can't maintain a relationship, and whose supposed intellectual superiority is actually a mask for deep insecurity and hypocrisy. He became less likable as he became more human, which seems counterintuitive but makes sense when you think about it. The early humor was that a dog was wiser than the people around him. The later humor is that a dog who thinks he's wise is actually just as flawed as everyone else. MacFarlane uses his real voice for Brian, and the character has always served as a vehicle for MacFarlane's own perspectives and personality. Many of Brian's political views and cultural opinions mirror MacFarlane's own, which gives the character an extra layer of self-awareness. When the show makes fun of Brian's pretentiousness, there's a sense that MacFarlane is poking fun at himself, acknowledging his own tendencies toward exactly the kind of behavior Brian exhibits. Lois Griffin started the series as a fairly standard sitcom wife and mother. She was the straight woman to Peter's comic relief, the responsible parent who held the family together while her husband got into one ridiculous situation after another. She had moments of her own personality, particularly her wealthy background and her martial arts skills, but she primarily existed in service of Peter's storylines. As the show continued, Lois's character became increasingly complex and occasionally darker. She developed a wilder side that surfaced in episodes exploring her past as a rebellious young woman from an extremely wealthy family. Episodes revealed her history with Gene Simmons, her brief career in adult entertainment, and various other surprising chapters of her pre-Peter life. The show also gave Lois more agency in storylines, though this sometimes came at the cost of making her less sympathetic. She became more willing to participate in Peter's schemes rather than serving as the voice of reason, and her parenting became increasingly questionable as the show's humor grew darker. Meg Griffin has perhaps the saddest character arc of anyone on the show, and the reasons behind it are surprisingly honest. MacFarlane has openly admitted that the family's constant abuse of Meg is the result of a bunch of male writers not knowing how to write for a teenage girl. That's a remarkably candid admission about a creative limitation, and it explains why Meg's role in the show has largely been reduced to serving as the family's punching bag. She's routinely ignored, insulted, and excluded by her own family, and the show has made this pattern of mistreatment into a running gag. What makes this interesting from a writing perspective is that the show has occasionally acknowledged how messed up this dynamic really is. There have been episodes where Meg confronts her family about their treatment of her, and the show briefly lets us see the situation from her perspective before resetting to the status quo. In one notable episode, it was revealed that the family deliberately picks on Meg because she's the only one who can take it without breaking, that the abuse actually serves a function in keeping the family together. It's a dark joke that borders on genuine social commentary about how families sometimes designate a scapegoat. Chris Griffin has remained the most consistent character over the show's run, probably because he's also the simplest. He started as Peter's overweight, unintelligent son and has stayed pretty much exactly that for 25 years. Seth Green's voice work has kept the character endearing despite his limited range, and the show finds moments of genuine sweetness in Chris's interactions with other characters. The most interesting thing about Chris might be the meta joke about his connection to Robot Chicken. Seth Green is the co-creator and star of Robot Chicken, and Family Guy frequently takes shots at that show, leading to in-universe moments where Chris, voiced by Green, gets angry when Peter insults Robot Chicken. Glenn Quagmire's evolution is one of the more troubling ones to track, because the show has gradually added darker layers to a character who was originally just a womanizing neighbor with a funny catchphrase. Early Quagmire was basically a Hugh Hefner knockoff, a smooth-talking ladies' man whose various conquests provided reliable comedic material. But as the show pushed into more extreme territory, Quagmire's behavior crossed from cartoonish womanizing into genuinely predatory territory. The show began making jokes about sexual assault, statutory relationships, and other behaviors that went well beyond the original conception of the character. At the same time, the show has occasionally given Quagmire moments of surprising depth and humanity. His relationship with his father, who transitions to become a woman, is handled with more nuance than you might expect from a show known for shock humor. His genuine hatred of Brian Griffin, which developed in later seasons, provided some of the show's sharpest character moments. The scene where Quagmire delivers a lengthy, pointed speech about why he despises Brian became one of the most discussed moments in the show's history, because it articulated criticisms of Brian that many fans had been feeling for years. The supporting cast has evolved just as dramatically. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-bound police officer neighbor, started as a more active and capable presence despite his disability but has increasingly been defined by his limitations. Cleveland Brown became significant enough to warrant his own spin-off show, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 before he returned to Family Guy. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West until his death in 2017, became one of the show's most beloved recurring characters through his deadpan delivery and absurd behavior. The show later renamed the character's position to honor West's memory, and the void left by his passing has never been fully filled. Now, let's talk about one of the most ambitious things Family Guy has ever attempted, and something that took the show from popular animated sitcom to genuine pop culture event. The Star Wars parody episodes represent Family Guy at the absolute peak of its ambition, and the story of how they came together involves George Lucas, Lucasfilm, and a legal situation that almost prevented them from existing at all. Family Guy had been making references to Star Wars since its very first season. Characters getting frozen in carbonite, escape pods, Jabba the Hutt, lightsaber fights, these references were scattered throughout the show like Easter eggs for science fiction fans. The Star Wars gags became so frequent and so elaborate that eventually Fox's legal department raised a red flag. They told the Family Guy production team that if they were going to keep using Star Wars imagery and references at this rate, they needed to get official clearance from Lucasfilm, because otherwise a lawsuit was inevitable. MacFarlane and his team heard this and assumed it was the end of the road for their Star Wars jokes. Getting permission from a major film franchise to parody their work seemed like a long shot at best. But when Lucasfilm was contacted, their response surprised everyone. They said yes. Not just a begrudging yes, but an enthusiastic one. It turned out that George Lucas himself was a fan of Family Guy. In a conversation with MacFarlane, Lucas revealed that he had recorded every single episode of Family Guy on his TiVo without ever having to buy the DVDs. Along with the stunt show Jackass, Family Guy was apparently the only show Lucas watched. That's a genuinely surreal piece of trivia, the creator of Star Wars unwinding after a long day by watching Peter Griffin's antics. With Lucasfilm's blessing secured, the Family Guy team went all in. The result was Blue Harvest, an hour-long parody of the original 1977 Star Wars film that served as the premiere of Family Guy's 6th season on September 23, 2007. The title itself was a deep-cut reference to the fake working title that Lucas used during the production of Return of the Jedi. When Return of the Jedi was being filmed on location, the production used Blue Harvest as a cover name, complete with fake posters and crew merchandise, to avoid the attention and inflated costs that would come with people knowing a Star Wars movie was filming in their area. MacFarlane naming his parody after this obscure bit of production history was a signal to Star Wars fans that the people making this episode genuinely knew their stuff. Lucasfilm's only real stipulation was that the characters had to look exactly as they did in the actual Star Wars films. This meant that the animation team had to essentially recreate the visual language of Star Wars within the Family Guy art style, which was a massive technical undertaking. The result was stunning. The episode recreated iconic scenes from A New Hope with remarkable fidelity while inserting Family Guy characters into the roles. Peter played Han Solo. Lois was Princess Leia. Chris was Luke Skywalker. Stewie was Darth Vader. Cleveland was R2-D2. Quagmire was CR3PO. Herbert the elderly pedophile, played Obi-Wan Kenobi, which was a casting choice that some reviewers criticized but which fit the show's irreverent approach. The episode was written by Alex Sulkin and directed by Dominic Polsino, both series veterans. The music was composed by Walter Murphy, but about 95% of the score was actually the original John Williams Star Wars music, with short edits and adaptations. Having access to that iconic score gave the episode an authenticity that elevated it beyond what most parodies can achieve. Guest stars included Chevy Chase, Beverly D'Angelo, Rush Limbaugh, and Leslie Nielsen, adding extra layers of pop culture reference to an already reference-heavy production. Blue Harvest premiered to 10.86 million viewers, which was an enormous number for the show. TV Guide later ranked it number 99 on its list of the 100 greatest episodes of all time. The critical reception was mixed to positive, with most reviewers acknowledging that the episode was clearly a labor of love even if it didn't always land as comedy. The episode also took a shot at the friendly competition between Family Guy and Robot Chicken. In the closing moments, Chris points out that Robot Chicken already did a Star Wars parody, and Peter dismisses the show, saying he's not a fan. Given that Chris is voiced by Seth Green, who created Robot Chicken, this was a layered bit of self-referential humor. The success of Blue Harvest led to 2 sequels. Something Dark Side parodied The Empire Strikes Back and aired during Season 8 in 2010. It's a Trap, parodying Return of the Jedi, followed in Season 9. Together, the 3 episodes formed the Laugh It Up, Fuzzball trilogy, which was also released as a standalone DVD collection. The episodes were such a hit that fans naturally asked whether the show would tackle the prequel trilogy or the sequel trilogy, but that never materialized. Alex Sulkin explained the reasons clearly. Creating the Star Wars parodies was genuinely exhausting for the writing team. By the time they finished the 3rd one, they were ready to kill themselves, as Sulkin put it. The creative effort required to sustain an hour-long parody while maintaining both comedic quality and visual fidelity to the source material was immense. Beyond the creative exhaustion, there was also a practical problem. In 2012, Disney acquired Lucasfilm, and with that acquisition came a much more protective approach to the Star Wars intellectual property. MacFarlane noted that Disney keeps a tighter hold on it, making future parodies unlikely. The warm, collaborative relationship that MacFarlane had enjoyed with Lucasfilm didn't translate to the new corporate owners. What made the Star Wars episode significant beyond just being funny was that they demonstrated Family Guy's ability to operate at a level of ambition far beyond its typical episode format. The show proved it could sustain extended narrative, deliver visually impressive animation, and execute large-scale production in a way that few animated comedies have ever attempted. Whether or not you think the Star Wars episodes are the show's best work, they represent a creative high watermark that elevated the entire series. Now, let's talk about the time Family Guy killed one of its most beloved characters and accidentally triggered one of the biggest fan revolts in television history. The death and resurrection of Brian Griffin is a case study in how passionate fan communities can influence creative decisions, and it's also a cautionary tale about what happens when a show plays with its audience's emotions. On November 24, 2013, Family Guy aired the 6th episode of its 12th season, titled Life of Brian. The episode started normally enough, with Brian and Stewie on one of their time travel adventures. They'd been messing around with Stewie's time machine, and after things went predictably wrong, they decided to destroy it to prevent any further disasters. They dumped the time machine at the junkyard and headed home. It seemed like a minor plot point, just Stewie getting rid of a device that had caused too much trouble. Nobody realized that this was actually setting up one of the most shocking moments in the show's history. When Brian and Stewie got home, they started playing street hockey in the road. Stewie went inside to get his knee pads, leaving Brian alone in the street. And that's when it happened. A car came speeding around the corner and hit Brian. There was no elaborate setup, no dramatic music, no warning. It just happened. One moment Brian was standing in the street, and the next he was lying on the pavement, badly injured. The family rushed Brian to the vet, but his injuries were too severe. Brian died on the operating table, surrounded by the Griffin family. His last words were simply, "You guys, I love you all." The scene was played completely straight, with none of the ironic detachment or comedic undercuts that typically characterize Family Guy's approach to emotional moments. The Griffins cried. There was a funeral. The show treated Brian's death with a seriousness and sincerity that was completely unlike anything the series had done before. Then, in the same episode, the family adopted a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos. Vinny was a friendly, Italian-accented replacement who immediately started filling Brian's role in the family. The episode ended with Stewie reluctantly accepting Vinny after the new dog shared his own story of loss and demonstrated that he understood what Stewie was going through. The reaction was immediate, massive, and overwhelmingly negative. Within hours of the episode airing, fans had taken to Twitter with the hashtag #BringBackBrian, which was mentioned at least 6,000 times within the first hour of broadcast and quickly became a trending topic. A petition appeared on Change.org directed at Seth MacFarlane and Fox Broadcasting Company, demanding Brian's resurrection. The petition read that Brian was an important part of the viewing experience and that he added a witty and sophisticated element to the show. Within 72 hours, the petition had gathered over 100,000 signatures, making it one of the fastest-growing entertainment-related petitions in the site's history. Facebook pages dedicated to mourning Brian and demanding his return sprang up overnight. One page called RIP Brian from Family Guy accumulated over 758,000 likes in just a few days. Major news outlets picked up the story, with CNN, TMZ, The Huffington Post, CBS, and countless others covering the fan reaction as a legitimate news event. Family Guy's official social media pages were bombarded with messages from angry fans, and hostile messages were directed at the show's production staff, including MacFarlane personally. The production team was genuinely surprised by the intensity of the reaction. Executive producer Steve Callahan told media outlets that the idea had gotten pitched in the writers' room and caught fire, and that they thought it could be a fun way to shake things up. He explained that they had gotten very excited about how the change would affect the family dynamics. They had chosen Brian over other characters because it seemed more in the realm of reality that a dog would get hit by a car than that one of the human family members would die. MacFarlane later said he was very surprised by the size of the reaction and saw the positive side of it, interpreting the anger as proof that people still really cared about the character. He told a Reddit audience that the team thought it would create a little bit of a stir, but the rage wasn't something they counted on. He also described how the other voice actors reacted when they learned Brian was being killed off. He said he thinks they were glad it wasn't them and that they were as shocked as anyone. What the fans didn't know was that the whole thing was planned as a temporary measure from the start. 3 episodes later, on December 15, 2013, the Christmas episode titled Christmas Guy revealed the resolution. Stewie, who was still grieving Brian's loss, encountered a version of himself from a different timeline who still had a working time machine. Using this alternate Stewie's device, our Stewie traveled back in time and pushed Brian out of the path of the car, preventing his death. The entire timeline of the previous 3 episodes was erased, and Brian was back as if nothing had happened. After the episode aired, MacFarlane tweeted a message that read, "Thanks for caring so much about the canine griffin. He is overcome with gratitude." He then added, "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be high." Some fans found the joke funny. Others found the entire chain of events frustrating and insulting. The criticism was that the show had toyed with viewers' emotions as a cheap publicity stunt, generating buzz and headlines by pretending to permanently remove a beloved character when the writers never intended to keep him dead. The replacement character, Vinny, appeared in only a couple of episodes after Brian's return, mostly in minor cutaway gags. Tony Sirico's performance was actually well received by many viewers, and some critics argued that the show would have been better served by keeping Vinny around for longer before bringing Brian back. The Italian dog with a Sopranos accent brought something fresh to the show's dynamic, and his relationship with Stewie showed genuine potential. But the intense fan pressure made a quick reversal almost inevitable. The Brian death storyline remains one of the most discussed events in Family Guy's history. It demonstrated the power of social media-driven fan campaigns, showed how quickly a production team can be forced to respond to audience reaction, and raised questions about whether shows should take creative risks when fans have the ability to apply enormous pressure for reversal. It also revealed something touching about the audience's relationship with Brian. Despite years of the character becoming increasingly pretentious and unlikable, fans still loved him deeply enough to stage a massive campaign for his return. Now, let's explore one of the most entertaining and enduring feuds in animation history, the rivalry between Family Guy and The Simpsons. This relationship spans decades, involves multiple shows, and culminated in one of the most anticipated crossover events in television. The comparisons between Family Guy and The Simpsons started the moment Family Guy premiered in 1999. Both shows were animated sitcoms airing on Fox, centered around dysfunctional families in middle American settings. Both featured a bumbling father, a more competent mother, underachieving children, and a wide cast of eccentric supporting characters. The similarities were impossible to ignore, and critics immediately started asking whether Family Guy was just a Simpsons knockoff. MacFarlane has always been open about The Simpsons' influence on his work. He's called it one of the greatest comedy shows of all time in its prime and acknowledged that it fundamentally changed his creative ambitions. But he's pushed back against the idea that Family Guy is merely derivative, arguing that Peter Griffin was more inspired by Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners than by Homer Simpson. Both Peter and Homer are overweight, dim-witted fathers who work at dead-end jobs and embarrass their families, but the way they approach the world is different. Peter is more aggressively stupid, more confrontational, and more willing to commit to absurd premises than Homer typically is. The Simpsons writers' room was apparently not convinced by this distinction. The show took shots at Family Guy through background gags and throwaway lines, with one famous example being a Simpsons episode that featured a Homer Simpson clone who was identified as Peter Griffin. These jabs were relatively light compared to what was coming, but they established that the Simpsons creative team viewed Family Guy as something between a competitor and an imitator. The situation escalated dramatically when South Park entered the conversation. In 2006, Trey Parker and Matt Stone aired the two-part episode Cartoon Wars, which was a scathing takedown of Family Guy and its reliance on cutaway gags. The South Park episodes portrayed Family Guy's writing process as being literally random, with jokes selected by manatees pushing idea balls into a pile. The message was brutal and direct. Family Guy was lazy comedy that substituted randomness for actual wit. It was the harshest public criticism the show had received from a fellow animated series, and it hit hard because it articulated something that many critics had been saying for years. The Simpsons writing staff apparently loved what South Park did. According to Trey Parker, after the Cartoon Wars episodes aired, the South Park team received flowers from the Simpsons writers with a note that read, "You're doing God's work by ripping on Family Guy." That's a pretty remarkable gesture, one animation team sending flowers to another for attacking a shared rival. It spoke to the depth of feeling that existed in the Simpsons writers' room about what they saw as an inferior show copying their formula. MacFarlane's response to all of this was surprisingly measured. He acknowledged the criticism, didn't pretend it wasn't personal, and generally took the position that his show can dish it out so it should be able to take it. But there were times when the rivalry got less friendly. Fox reportedly stepped in at least once to prevent Family Guy from airing a joke about The Simpsons, leading to accusations that the network was protecting its older, more established franchise. MacFarlane has claimed that when Family Guy does a joke about The Simpsons it gets cut, but when The Simpsons does a joke about Family Guy it stays in, and that Fox is afraid of James L. Brooks, who is one of The Simpsons' executive producers. The rivalry reached its culmination in 2014 with the hour-long crossover episode titled The Simpsons Guy. The idea was first suggested by executive producer Richard Apple, who had previously worked as a writer and producer on The Simpsons. Apple got MacFarlane's approval and then reached out to The Simpsons executive producers Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Al Jean. They gave their blessing, partly because Apple was a trusted former colleague and partly because the crossover could be positioned as a Family Guy episode, keeping it separate from Simpsons continuity. 5 of the 6 main Simpsons voice cast members recorded their parts for the episode, with Harry Shearer being the only one absent due to scheduling conflicts. The Simpsons creative staff told the Family Guy writers they had free rein to do anything they wanted with the characters and not to pull any punches. Supervising director Peter Shin, who had previously worked as a layout artist on The Simpsons, spent time adjusting the Griffin family's designs to fit the visual specifications of Springfield, including dimming the whites of their eyeballs so they wouldn't look too bright in The Simpsons' color palette. The episode itself played out like a greatest hits compilation of the rivalry between the two shows. The Griffins flee Quahog after Peter's misogynistic comic strip angers local women, and their car is stolen outside Springfield. The Simpsons take them in, and the two families begin interacting. Homer and Peter bond over beer. Bart and Stewie become friends, with a scene comparing their different approaches to prank calls that highlighted the fundamental tonal difference between the two shows. Lisa tries to help Meg discover a hidden talent, eventually getting jealous when Meg turns out to be naturally gifted at the saxophone. The centerpiece of the episode was an 8-minute fight between Homer and Peter that ranks among the most elaborate action sequences in either show's history. The brawl started over a disagreement about Pawtucket Patriot Ale versus Duff Beer, a deliberately silly conflict that served as a metaphor for the show's real rivalry, and escalated into a city-destroying mega-battle that incorporated iconic Simpsons locations including the Springfield Gorge from the classic Season 2 episode Bart the Daredevil. The fight was meticulously animated and intentionally absurd, with both characters surviving injuries that would have killed them hundreds of times over. Reception to the crossover was decidedly mixed. Some critics praised the episode's self-awareness and the clever way it addressed the similarities and differences between the two shows. Others felt the episode relied too heavily on Family Guy's brand of humor at the expense of what makes The Simpsons work, which was inevitable given that the episode was written by Family Guy's staff rather than The Simpsons writers. The episode also generated controversy for a joke where Stewie calls Moe's Tavern and tells Moe that his sister is being raped, a gag that was far more in keeping with Family Guy's shock humor than The Simpsons' comparatively gentler approach. The crossover was technically a Family Guy episode, which meant that the rivalry, for all its intensity, was resolved on Family Guy's turf. Whether that constitutes a win for MacFarlane's show or just an awkward compromise depends on your perspective. Since the crossover, both shows have continued to take occasional shots at each other, with The Simpsons making background references to Family Guy and Family Guy returning the favor. As recently as 2024, The Simpsons included a gag where a door handle shaped like Stewie led to a secret room of television considered not very good, a fairly clear jab at its longtime competitor. The rivalry between these two shows has become one of the defining features of both series' identities. It's driven by genuine creative differences, real professional competition, and decades of accumulated history. But there's also an element of mutual respect buried beneath all the insults. Both shows have survived for decades in an industry that constantly tries to replace them with something newer and cheaper. Both have faced criticism for declining quality while continuing to attract loyal audiences. And both have shaped the landscape of animated television in ways that will be felt long after they eventually go off the air. Let's dive into one of the darkest and most complicated chapters of Family Guy's history, the episodes that got banned, the scenes that got censored, and the battles with watchdog groups that turned a cartoon about a talking baby into one of the most controversial shows on television. The most famous banned episode in Family Guy history is Partial Terms of Endearment, which was the 21st episode of Season 8. The episode tackled the subject of abortion directly, something that almost no primetime television show had attempted, and certainly no animated comedy had dared to approach. In the episode, Lois agrees to be a surrogate mother for her old college friend Naomi and Naomi's partner Dale. But when the couple dies in a car accident, Lois is left with an impossible decision: should she carry the pregnancy to term or have an abortion? The episode attempted to present both sides of the debate, with Peter initially supporting the idea of carrying the baby and then switching to support termination after being influenced by pro-life activists, which was played for ironic comedy. It was Family Guy doing what Family Guy does, taking a controversial topic and mining it for humor while still engaging with the substance of the issue. By the standards of most Family Guy episodes, Partial Terms of Endearment wasn't even particularly extreme. It didn't show anything graphic, and the treatment of the subject matter was actually more thoughtful than you'd expect from a show known for its shock value. But Fox didn't see it that way. Before Season 8 even aired, the network announced that Partial Terms of Endearment would not be broadcast in the United States. The decision was announced at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, where the Family Guy team revealed the ban to fans. Kevin Reilly, who was president of Fox at the time, defended the decision in an interview with the New York Times, saying that abortion was an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time, and that of all the issues, this one seemed to be the most of a hot button. His conclusion was that the episode felt like it could cause trouble, and it was just not worth it. Fox also asked Cartoon Network's Adult Swim not to air the episode, effectively blocking it from all domestic broadcast outlets. The episode became the only Family Guy installment to receive a comprehensive domestic ban, which actually made it more famous than it would have been if it had simply aired normally. Across the Atlantic, the BBC had no such qualms and aired the episode in its regular time slot, where it reached about 1 million UK homes and received generally positive reviews. The episode was also included on the Season 8 DVD box set, even in the United States, which meant that American fans could watch it at home but couldn't see it on television. It was a strange compromise that highlighted how different the standards were between broadcast television and home media. The Partial Terms ban wasn't the first time a Family Guy episode had been pulled from the schedule. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which was a third season episode, was originally supposed to air in 2000 but was yanked by Fox over concerns that its humor about Jewish stereotypes could be interpreted as anti-Semitic. Peter sings a song called I Need a Juice set to the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio, and the episode revolves around Peter seeking out a Jewish person to help him manage his finances. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim in 2003 and later on Fox in 2004, by which point the initial controversy had largely blown over. Then there was Turban Cowboy, which aired in March 2013 and contains what might be the single most unfortunate piece of timing in television history. The episode included a cutaway gag showing Peter driving a car through the Boston Marathon, mowing down runners. Approximately 1 month after the episode aired, the actual Boston Marathon bombing occurred on April 15, 2013, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. The coincidence was horrifying, and the episode was immediately pulled from all reruns and streaming platforms. Even MacFarlane seemed to regret the scene's existence. The episode didn't return to any platform until September 2022, when it finally reappeared on Hulu, nearly a decade after its original air date. Beyond individual episode bans, Family Guy has faced a constant, sustained assault from the Parents Television Council. The PTC, which was founded in 1995 by conservative activist L. Brent Bozell, positioned itself as a guardian of family values in entertainment and made Family Guy its primary target from almost the moment the show premiered. The organization named Family Guy its worst TV show of the week on more than 40 separate occasions. It filed numerous complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, arguing that the show's content violated broadcast standards for profanity, animated nudity, and violence. One episode, Family Guy, generated approximately 188,000 complaint letters from PTC members to the FCC, though the agency never took action against the show. The PTC also went after Family Guy's advertisers, pressuring companies like Wrigley and Burger King to pull their commercials from the show on the grounds that their products appeal to children who might accidentally watch an adult animated comedy. They criticized Fox for not including appropriate content descriptors in the show's ratings and for scheduling Family Guy during early prime time hours when children might be watching. The organization's crusade against the show became one of its defining campaigns. MacFarlane's response to the PTC was characteristically combative. His comparison of PTC criticism to receiving hate mail from Hitler became one of his most quoted lines, and the show itself took direct shots at the organization on multiple occasions. In one episode, Peter directs viewers to complain to the Family Television Council, a barely disguised reference to the PTC. The relationship between MacFarlane and the PTC eventually took an unexpected turn when PTC President Tim Winter actually developed a friendly rapport with MacFarlane over a complaint about a specific episode. Winter later said that if the president of the Parents Television Council and the creator of Family Guy could have that kind of relationship, maybe other folks might be able to try to do the same thing. The PTC eventually filed for bankruptcy in 2025, ending its decades-long campaign against shows like Family Guy. International censorship of Family Guy has been just as extensive and often far more aggressive than domestic regulation. Different countries have imposed widely different standards on the show based on their cultural norms, religious beliefs, and political priorities. In Indonesia, entire episodes were banned for containing too much violence, including episodes with nothing more than standard cartoon slapstick. The United Kingdom developed strict policies around flashing lights and rapid motion to prevent seizures, leading to scenes being slowed down or cut entirely. Countries with large Muslim populations censored Sandy from SpongeBob's Bikini, but the same principle applied to any Family Guy content that showed too much skin or too little clothing, which in a show as irreverent as Family Guy meant a lot of editing. Religious censorship created some of the most dramatic alterations to the show. In Arabic-speaking countries, wedding scenes were cut because they didn't align with religious marriage customs. References to Christmas were removed or replaced. Episodes dealing with romantic themes were heavily edited or banned outright. The episode The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, which depicted Jesus in sexual situations, was predictably explosive in countries with significant Christian or Muslim populations. The show's willingness to satirize religion, which is one of its defining characteristics in the United States, made it virtually impossible to air unedited in dozens of countries around the world. Language censorship added another dimension to the international editing process. Words like stupid, idiot, and dumb, which appear in practically every Family Guy episode, were considered too harsh for children's television in many countries and had to be dubbed over with milder alternatives or removed entirely. In the Philippines, these words were translated as useless or ugly because the original English terms were considered too strong. The result was that different countries were watching fundamentally different versions of the show, with the humor and characterization altered to fit local sensitivities. The cumulative effect of all this censorship is that Family Guy, like many globally distributed shows, exists in dozens of different versions around the world. Fans who have compared edits from different countries have found remarkable variations in what's considered acceptable versus what gets cut. Violence that's perfectly fine in America gets removed in parts of Asia. Sexual content that's allowed in Europe gets cut in the Middle East. Language that's unremarkable in English-speaking countries gets sanitized in others. The show that Seth MacFarlane created has been fractured into culturally specific versions that sometimes bear only a passing resemblance to the original. Now, let's examine the legal battles that have put Family Guy in the crosshairs of lawyers, copyright holders, and celebrities who weren't amused by the show's parodies. Family Guy's entire comedic approach relies on referencing, parodying, and satirizing other works of art, public figures, and cultural phenomena. This makes it inherently vulnerable to legal challenges from people who feel their work or likeness has been used without permission. Over the show's run, several of these challenges have resulted in actual lawsuits, and the outcomes have helped shape the legal landscape around parody and fair use in American entertainment. The most significant lawsuit came from Born Company Music Publishers, which owns the copyright to the song When You Wish Upon a Star from the 1940 Disney film Pinocchio. In October 2007, Born Company sued Fox, claiming that the Family Guy song I Need a Jew from the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was copyright infringement. The song used the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star with completely different lyrics about Peter Griffin wanting to find a Jewish person to help him with his finances. Born Company argued that the parody was nothing more than a thinly veiled copy of their original composition, and that the altered lyrics, which they characterized as anti-Semitic in nature, had distorted a wholesome classic. The lawsuit named 20th Century Fox, Fox Broadcasting, Cartoon Network, Seth MacFarlane, and composer Walter Murphy as defendants. MacFarlane was apparently not particularly worried when he heard about the suit, and his confidence turned out to be justified. In March 2009, U.S. District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy, holding that the song I Need a Jew was a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star and therefore exempt from liability under the fair use doctrine of U.S. copyright law. The court found that the lyrics were strikingly different from the original, that the amount of the melody used was no more than necessary to make the object of the parody recognizable, and that the new song had no effect on the value of or potential market for the original. It was a clean, decisive victory for Family Guy that established an important precedent for how parody music is treated under copyright law. The Carol Burnett lawsuit was another headline-grabbing legal battle. In the episode Petrotica from 2006, Family Guy depicted a character resembling Carol Burnett's famous charwoman character, but placed her working in an adult establishment. Burnett, a legendary comedian who had created the charwoman character for her own variety show decades earlier, was not pleased. In March 2007, she filed a $2 million lawsuit against 20th Century Fox, alleging copyright infringement and misappropriation of her name and likeness. She argued that the show had used her character without permission and portrayed her in a distasteful manner. After 3 months of deliberation, the court ruled in favor of Fox and Family Guy. The judge acknowledged that the parody did portray Burnett in a distasteful manner, but determined that the parody was protected by the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech. The judge also noted that many public figures are frequent targets of crude humor and that Burnett's original character was far more creative than anything the Family Guy writers had produced. It was a ruling that essentially said, yes, this is offensive, but that's the point of parody, and the law protects it. A third notable legal dispute involved actor and comedian Art Metronow, who filed a lawsuit over a scene in the direct-to-video movie Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story. The scene featured Jesus Christ performing Metronow's signature comedy routine, which involved faux magical hand gestures and humming a distinctive tune. Metronow, who had performed this routine on shows like The Tonight Show, argued that this was protected under copyright law. The lawsuit was initially filed in December 2007 and then withdrawn when it appeared that the parties had settled. But Metronow refiled the suit in September 2008, seeking $2 million. In July 2009, the court rejected Fox's motion for dismissal, finding that the parody did potentially violate Metronow's work. The case was eventually settled out of court in 2010 for an undisclosed amount, making it one of the few legal challenges that actually cost the show money. These legal battles illustrate the tightrope that Family Guy walks every time it references real people, real songs, or real cultural works. The show's entire comedic identity is built on parody and pop culture reference, which means it's constantly operating in the gray zone between protected speech and potential infringement. The court victories in the Bourne Company and Carol Burnett cases helped establish that Family Guy's approach to parody falls within the bounds of fair use, but the Metronow settlement showed that there are limits, and that sometimes it's cheaper and easier to pay than to fight. Finally, let's talk about the complicated relationship between Seth MacFarlane and the show that made him famous, because it's a story that says a lot about what happens when a creator outlives their own enthusiasm for a project. MacFarlane's feelings about Family Guy have been an open secret in the entertainment industry for years. In a 2011 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, he stated plainly that he wished Family Guy was over. He said he believed that 7 seasons was about the right lifespan for a television series, and given that the show was already well past that point, his desire to move on was understandable. At the time, the comment raised eyebrows because it seemed unusual for a creator to publicly wish for the cancellation of his own successful show. But MacFarlane wasn't just being difficult. He was expressing a genuine creative frustration that many long-running show creators experience but few are willing to articulate. MacFarlane backed up his words with actions. During a Reddit AMA session in 2017, he confirmed that he hadn't written for Family Guy since 2010. By that point, his role on the show had been reduced to voice acting and executive producing. He was no longer crafting the stories, developing the characters, or shaping the direction of the series. The show that bears his name and is still identified with him more than any other individual was essentially running without its creator's direct creative involvement. Instead of Family Guy, MacFarlane poured his creative energy into other projects. Ted, his 2012 comedy film about a man and his talking teddy bear, became a massive box office hit, grossing over $549 million worldwide and spawning a sequel and a television series. A Million Ways to Die in the West, his 2014 Western comedy was less commercially successful but reflected MacFarlane's genuine interest in exploring different genres. The Orville, his science fiction series that premiered in 2017, was arguably his most ambitious project, essentially creating a new Star Trek-style show that blended sincere science fiction storytelling with MacFarlane's comedic sensibility. The Orville earned critical praise and a devoted fan base, proving that MacFarlane was capable of much more than the crude shock humor that Family Guy is known for. The tension between MacFarlane's creative ambitions and Family Guy's continued existence has been a recurring theme throughout the show's later years. He's become something of a reluctant face of a franchise that no longer fully represents his artistic interests. When he shows up to record voices for Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, he's performing the work of a voice actor rather than the work of a creator. The stories being told, the jokes being written, and the direction of the characters are all being handled by other people while MacFarlane provides the sonic infrastructure that holds it all together. This situation has contributed to what many fans and critics identify as a decline in the show's quality from approximately season 8 onward. Without MacFarlane's direct creative involvement, the writing team has been left to maintain the show's voice and humor without the person who originally defined both of those things. Some writers have risen to the challenge, producing episodes that stand alongside the show's best work. Others have struggled, and the result is a show that's more inconsistent than it was in its prime. The cutaway gags, which were once carefully curated and genuinely surprising, sometimes feel lazy and obvious. The character dynamics, which MacFarlane spent years developing, occasionally lose their nuance. The shock humor, which MacFarlane deployed with strategic precision, sometimes crosses into cruelty without the payoff that justified the transgression. But here's the thing about Family Guy's longevity. Even in its supposedly diminished state, the show continues to attract millions of viewers. It continues to generate headlines when it tackles controversial topics. It continues to produce moments of genuine brilliance amid the inconsistency. The Star Wars episodes, Brian's death, the Simpsons crossover, and various other landmark moments have all occurred during the period when MacFarlane was supposedly checked out. The show is bigger and more established than its creator's involvement, which is both a testament to the strength of what MacFarlane built and a source of ambivalence for the man himself. The show's legacy is complicated in ways that mirror MacFarlane's own feelings about it. Family Guy fundamentally changed what was possible in animated television. It proved that a cancelled show could come back stronger than ever. It pioneered the cutaway gag format that has been imitated by countless other shows. It made Seth MacFarlane one of the wealthiest and most influential people in entertainment. It gave us some of the most quotable lines and memorable moments in television history. But it also pushed the boundaries of taste in ways that sometimes crossed from edgy into genuinely harmful. It created a template for shock comedy that prioritized transgression over craft. And its treatment of certain characters and topics, particularly its reliance on stereotypes and its casual cruelty toward Meg, reflects the limitations of its predominantly male writers' room. Family Guy has been called many things over its 25-year run. It's been called brilliant and lazy, groundbreaking and derivative, hilarious and offensive, sometimes all within the same episode. It survived 2 cancellations, weathered countless controversies, outlasted its creator's own enthusiasm, and earned a place in the pop culture pantheon that seems nearly permanent. The show has been renewed through at least 2029, which means it will have been on the air for 30 years by the time its current deal expires. Whether that longevity is a good thing depends entirely on your perspective. For fans who still tune in every Sunday, Family Guy remains a reliable source of entertainment that doesn't take itself too seriously and isn't afraid to go anywhere for a laugh. For critics, it represents the triumph of brand recognition over creative ambition, a show that continues to exist because it can rather than because it should. And for MacFarlane himself, it's the foundation of an empire that has enabled everything else he's ever done, even as it remains the thing he's least passionate about creating. That's the strange, fascinating, occasionally dark story of Family Guy. A show born from a college thesis project and a $50,000 pilot budget that grew into one of the most successful and controversial animated series in television history. A show that was literally saved from permanent cancellation by college students buying DVDs and late-night cable viewers who happened to leave their TVs on. A show whose creator missed a doomed flight by 10 minutes because he drank too much the night before. A show that has been banned, censored, sued, and condemned by everyone from conservative watchdog groups to fellow animated series, and has emerged from every battle still standing, still making jokes, and still finding new audiences. But we're not done yet. Let's take a detour and talk about some of the most memorable recurring elements, Easter eggs, and running gags that have defined Family Guy's identity over the decades, because while the big controversies and behind-the-scenes drama make for great stories, the heart of Family Guy has always been in the details. The small, obsessive touches that reward loyal viewers and create the kind of shared cultural vocabulary that keeps a show alive in people's minds long after the credits roll. The chicken fights might be the single most iconic recurring element in the entire series. The ongoing feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken started in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, when the chicken gave Peter an expired coupon. What began as a brief gag about disproportionate revenge escalated into one of the most elaborate and absurd running jokes in television history. Each time Peter and the chicken encounter each other, they engage in massive, city-destroying fights that play out like action movie set pieces. The battles demolish buildings, destroy vehicles, interrupt other storylines, and go on for minutes at a time, far longer than any reasonable person would expect. The animation quality during these sequences is noticeably higher than the rest of the episode, with the show clearly allocating extra resources to make the fights as cinematic and ridiculous as possible. What makes the chicken fights work is their total commitment to the bit. The show doesn't wink at the audience or try to justify why two characters are engaged in what amounts to a small-scale war over a coupon. The fights just happen, they escalate beyond all reason, and then the show moves on like nothing unusual occurred. They're a pure distillation of Family Guy's comedic philosophy: take a simple idea, remove all restraint, and follow it to its most extreme possible conclusion. The fights became so beloved that Family Guy dedicated entire episodes to them, with later installments adding new wrinkles like the chicken's wife getting involved and other characters being drawn into the mayhem. These sequences took enormous amounts of time and resources to animate, but they became some of the show's most rewatched and most shared moments. The Conway Twitty cutaway gag is another recurring element that divided fans but perfectly encapsulates the show's approach to comedy. In several episodes, Family Guy would interrupt its own storyline to show a full, unedited performance of a Conway Twitty song. Not a parody, not a joke version. The actual Conway Twitty performing a complete song, often for 2 or 3 minutes of screen time. The first time it happened, viewers were confused. The second time, they started to get the joke. The third time and beyond, it became a litmus test for whether you were on Family Guy's wavelength or not. The joke was that there was no joke. The show was deliberately wasting its own screen time with an unrelated musical performance, challenging the audience's expectations about what a comedy show is supposed to do with its 22 minutes of airtime. Some fans found it brilliantly subversive. Others found it lazy and infuriating. MacFarlane and the writers seemed to take particular pleasure in the polarized reaction, which of course encouraged them to keep doing it. The evil monkey in Chris's closet was a recurring gag that ran for years before getting its own resolution. Early in the series, Chris would occasionally mention that there was an evil monkey living in his closet, and we'd see the monkey pointing menacingly at the audience with a sinister expression. Nobody believed Chris, and the monkey became a symbol of the kind of thing that adults dismiss as childhood fantasy. Years later, the show revealed that the monkey wasn't actually evil at all. He had been acting out because of personal struggles, including a divorce. It was a surprisingly sympathetic resolution to what had been presented as a simple sight gag, and it showed that the writers were capable of developing even the most minor recurring elements into something more meaningful. Herbert, the elderly neighbor with a visible attraction to Chris, is one of the show's most controversial recurring characters. Herbert appears regularly throughout the series, making comments about Chris that are clearly inappropriate and predatory. The show plays this for laughs, using Herbert's raspy voice and transparent attempts to get close to Chris as a source of dark comedy. Critics have argued that having a pedophile character in an animated comedy normalizes predatory behavior and makes light of a serious issue. Defenders of the character argue that the show is mocking predatory behavior rather than endorsing it, and that Herbert is consistently portrayed as pathetic and unsuccessful in his attempts. The debate around Herbert illustrates the broader tension in Family Guy's comedy between punching at taboo subjects and the potential consequences of making those subjects seem more acceptable or less serious. The Kool-Aid Man crashing through walls, greased-up deaf guy running through various scenes, the recurring appearances of Death as a character who hangs out with the family, and the constant jabs at Meg's appearance and popularity are all examples of recurring elements that have become part of Family Guy's DNA. Each one started as a single joke and evolved into something more through repetition and variation. The show's willingness to return to the same wells over and over again is both a strength and a weakness. At its best, repetition deepens a joke, adding new layers each time the audience encounters a familiar setup. At its worst, it becomes exactly what critics accuse Family Guy of being: lazy comedy that substitutes familiarity for invention. The multiverse episodes deserve special mention because they represent some of the show's most creative and visually inventive storytelling. Road to the Multiverse, which aired in Season 8, sent Brian and Stewie through dozens of alternate realities, each one with its own distinct visual style. One universe was drawn in the style of a Disney animated film. Another was rendered as live-action footage. One was animated in the style of a 1940s cartoon, and another looked like it was drawn by a robot. Each reality was a self-contained visual experiment, and the animation team clearly had a blast creating widely different art styles while keeping the characters recognizable. The multiverse episodes became fan favorites because they showed that Family Guy was capable of pushing the boundaries of what an animated sitcom could look like, not just what it could say. The music of Family Guy is something that doesn't get enough attention in discussions about the show. Walter Murphy's compositions are genuinely impressive, providing lush, full orchestral arrangements that would be right at home in a feature film. MacFarlane's personal love of classic American standards and big band music has influenced the show's musical identity from the very beginning. The show's opening theme, which deliberately echoes the opening of All in the Family with Peter and Lois singing at the piano, sets the tone for a show that takes its music seriously even when it doesn't take anything else seriously. Over the years, Family Guy has produced some genuinely memorable original songs, including Shapoopy from the episode Patriot Games, which became so popular that it was performed at real NFL halftime shows. The Road to episodes, which feature Brian and Stewie on various adventures together, represent the show at its most ambitious and most cohesive. These episodes, which are loosely inspired by the Hope and Crosby Road movies from the 1940s and 50s, tend to have stronger narratives and better character development than typical Family Guy episodes. They're also where the Brian and Stewie relationship gets its most nuanced exploration. Episodes like Road to the Multiverse, Road to Germany, and Road to the North Pole are consistently ranked among the best in the series, and they've become a tradition that fans look forward to. The road to format gives the writers a framework that encourages tighter storytelling while still allowing for the cutaway gags and pop culture references that define the show. Let's also talk about Adam West, because his contribution to Family Guy is one of the most touching and unexpected stories in the show's history. When MacFarlane cast the real Adam West, the actor best known for playing Batman in the 1966 television series, as the mayor of Quahog, it could have been just another celebrity cameo played for nostalgia. Instead, West became one of the show's most beloved recurring characters and one of the highlights of any episode he appeared in. West played a fictionalized version of himself, a mayor whose behavior ranged from mildly eccentric to completely unhinged. He delivered his lines with a deadpan sincerity that made even the most absurd material sound dignified, and his comic timing was impeccable. What made West's performance special was how completely he committed to the character. There was no irony or self-deprecation in his delivery. He played the mayor of Quahog as though he were playing Hamlet, giving every ridiculous line his full dramatic weight. The contrast between the gravity of his performance and the absurdity of the material created comedy that no other actor could have produced. West's presence also elevated the show's connection to pop culture history in a way that felt organic rather than forced. Here was Batman himself, playing a delusional small-town mayor, and somehow it worked. When Adam West passed away on June 9, 2017, at the age of 88, the loss was felt deeply by the Family Guy team and its audience. The show dedicated episodes to his memory and eventually renamed the character's role to honor him. The character of Mayor West was retired rather than recast, a decision that reflected how irreplaceable West's specific contribution had been. The show later renamed Quahog's high school to Adam West High, a permanent tribute to the actor who had given the show so much. No one who takes over the mayoral role will be Mayor West. That name belongs to one person, and the show has been careful to preserve that distinction. Speaking of voice actors and their impact, let's discuss Mike Henry and the controversy surrounding the voice of Cleveland Brown. For the first 19 seasons of the show, Henry, who is white, voiced Cleveland, who is black. This arrangement didn't attract much attention during the show's early years, when most animated shows featured white actors voicing characters of different races. But as cultural conversations around representation in media intensified, particularly following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the subsequent nationwide reckoning with racial injustice, Henry made the decision to step down from the role. In June 2020, Henry tweeted that he was stepping away from voicing Cleveland, saying that he loved the character but felt it was wrong for a white person to continue voicing a person of color. The decision was praised by many in the industry and the fan community as a positive step toward more inclusive casting. Arif Zahir, a young YouTuber who had gained attention for his spot-on Cleveland impression, was cast as the new voice of Cleveland starting with season 20. The transition was handled smoothly, with Zahir bringing his own energy to the character while maintaining the essential qualities that made Cleveland recognizable. The change sparked a broader conversation about race and voice acting in animation that extended far beyond Family Guy. The Simpsons underwent a similar change when Hank Azaria stopped voicing Apu Nahasapimapitil, and several other animated shows made comparable adjustments. Whether you view these changes as necessary corrections to a problematic industry practice or as overcorrections driven by social pressure, they represent a significant shift in how animated shows think about casting and representation. Let's talk about some lesser-known facts and fascinating pieces of trivia that even dedicated fans might not be aware of. For instance, MacFarlane's middle name, Woodbury, follows a long tradition on his mother's side of the family. When he asked his grandfather about the name's origins, his grandfather told him that his great-grandmother had given him the name because she thought the town drunk was the funniest man she'd ever met, and Woodbury was his name. There's something beautifully fitting about the creator of Peter Griffin being named after a town drunk his ancestor found amusing. MacFarlane originally wanted to be a Disney animator, inspired by the studio's late 1980s renaissance. Films like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast fired his imagination and made him believe that animation was the noblest pursuit in entertainment. It wasn't until The Simpsons showed him that animation could be subversive and adult-oriented that he changed course. Even today, MacFarlane's love of classic Hollywood is evident in everything he does. His personal albums of classic standards, recorded with full orchestras, have been critically acclaimed. His hosting of the Academy Awards in 2013, while controversial, showcased his ability to perform live at the highest level. The man who created Peter Griffin can also sing Frank Sinatra songs at Carnegie Hall, which is a contrast that tells you everything about the gap between Family Guy and its creator's actual artistic sensibility. At the 2009 Emmy Awards, Family Guy became the first animated series to be nominated for Outstanding Comedy Series since The Flintstones received the same honor back in 1961. That's a span of 48 years between nominations, which gives you a sense of how difficult it is for an animated show to be taken seriously alongside live-action comedies. The Simpsons had come close to a nomination in 1993, but voters had been hesitant to pit animated shows against live-action programs. Family Guy breaking through that barrier was a significant moment for animated television as a whole, even though the show didn't end up winning. The show has accumulated 9 Emmy Awards over its run, including wins for Outstanding Voiceover Performance for MacFarlane's portrayal of Stewie and Outstanding Music and Lyrics for the song You Got a Lot to See from the episode Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows. The show was also nominated for a Grammy Award in 2011, which is the kind of cross-platform recognition that very few television series of any kind achieve. These accolades helped legitimize Family Guy as more than just a crude comedy, establishing it as a technically accomplished and creatively significant work within the broader television landscape. Family Guy's impact on popular culture extends far beyond the show itself. The series has generated an enormous merchandising empire, with everything from clothing and toys to video games and books. The Family Guy video game, released in 2006 for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PlayStation Portable, featured playable characters including Peter, Brian, and Stewie and was rated M for mature. Several books have been published about the Family Guy universe, including Stewie's Guide to World Domination and Brian Griffin's Guide to Booze, Broads, and the Lost Art of Being a Man, the latter of which was written from Brian's perspective as though he were a real author. The Cleveland Show, which spun off from Family Guy in 2009, took Cleveland Brown and placed him in the fictional town of Steubenville, Virginia. The show ran for 4 seasons before being cancelled in 2013, at which point Cleveland returned to Quahog and Family Guy. American Dad, MacFarlane's other animated series, has been more successful both critically and commercially, running for over 20 seasons and developing its own distinct identity separate from Family Guy. The fact that MacFarlane was running multiple animated series simultaneously, while also pursuing film and other television projects, speaks to his extraordinary productivity, even as it may have contributed to his diminishing engagement with Family Guy specifically. The show has also had some genuinely poignant moments that cut through its usual irreverence. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8, which was celebrated as the show's 150th episode, featured just two characters locked in a bank vault for the entire runtime with no cutaway gags and no B-plot. The episode dealt with themes of friendship, mortality, and meaning in surprisingly raw terms, with Stewie eventually admitting that Brian is the one person who makes his life worth living. It was unlike anything the show had done before or has really done since, and it divided fans just as dramatically as everything else the show does. Some called it the best episode in the series. Others found it pretentious and out of character for a show built on irreverence. Family Guy's influence on the broader landscape of animated comedy cannot be overstated. The success of the cutaway gag format inspired imitators and also pushed other animated shows to develop their own distinct comedic identities in response. Shows like Robot Chicken, which essentially built an entire format around the cutaway concept, owe a creative debt to what Family Guy popularized. American Dad deliberately moved away from the cutaway format to differentiate itself from its predecessor. Bob's Burgers, which joined the Fox animated lineup later, positioned itself as the anti-Family Guy, favoring warmth and character development over shock value and pop culture references. The landscape of animated comedy in the 2000s and 2010s was shaped in large part by how other creators positioned themselves relative to Family Guy. The show's relationship with social media has also been fascinating to watch evolve. Family Guy was one of the first television shows to become a genuine phenomenon on platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Clips from the show were among the most shared and most viewed content on early YouTube, and the show's quotable lines became the building blocks of early internet humor culture. Phrases like giggity, Cool Whip, and it's a trap entered the general lexicon through social media sharing. The viral nature of Family Guy clips helped maintain and grow the show's audience even during periods when its traditional Nielsen ratings were declining, demonstrating the same dynamic that had saved the show from cancellation through DVD sales years earlier. The evolution of Family Guy from broadcast television curiosity to cultural institution mirrors broader changes in how Americans consume and relate to entertainment. The show started in an era when broadcast ratings were the only metric that mattered and survived into an age where streaming, social media engagement, and merchandise sales are equally important indicators of a show's value. Family Guy's ability to adapt to each new phase of the entertainment industry, from broadcast to DVD to cable reruns to streaming to social media virality, is perhaps its most impressive achievement. The content of the show has changed dramatically over 25 years, but its ability to find and maintain an audience has remained remarkably consistent. The economic footprint of Family Guy is staggering when you consider everything it encompasses. Beyond the television show itself, the franchise includes international syndication deals, streaming rights, merchandise licensing, video game development, book publishing, DVD and Blu-ray sales, and the spin-off series it has generated. Fox's decision to bring the show back in 2005 didn't just save a television program. It launched a multi-billion-dollar entertainment franchise that continues to generate revenue across dozens of platforms and territories worldwide. The show's most recent seasons have shown some interesting creative developments. There's been a noticeable effort to moderate some of the show's more extreme tendencies, particularly around jokes that rely on stereotypes or punch down at marginalized groups. This evolution reflects broader changes in comedy culture and audience expectations, as well as the reality that a show airing in 2025 operates in a very different social environment than one that aired in 1999. Whether these adjustments represent genuine growth or merely strategic adaptation is debatable, but they've resulted in episodes that feel somewhat different from the peak shock humor era of the late 2000s and early 2010s. At the same time, the show continues to push boundaries in ways that generate headlines and discussion. Family Guy's willingness to tackle controversial subjects, from politics to religion to social issues, remains one of its defining characteristics. The show exists in a permanent state of creative tension between its desire to provoke and the increasing social consequences of provocation. Navigating that tension is what keeps Family Guy interesting even after 25 years, and it's what will continue to define the show for however long it remains on the air. What's remarkable about the Family Guy story, when you step back and look at the full picture, is how improbable every chapter of it has been. An 8-year-old gets a comic strip published in a newspaper. A college student creates an animated short that catches the eye of a major studio. A 24-year-old gets $50,000 to hand animate a pilot at his kitchen table. The show premieres after the Super Bowl, gets cancelled twice, gets saved by DVD sales in an unprecedented television resurrection, and the creator almost dies on a plane that flies into the World Trade Center. Every step of the journey required something unlikely to happen, and every time, against reasonable odds, it did. Family Guy is currently secured on television through 2029, with Fox's four-season renewal deal ensuring that it will reach at least 27 seasons. That takes it past the 30-year mark if we count from the original 1999 premiere, putting it in rarefied air alongside The Simpsons as one of the longest-running primetime animated series in American history. The show has survived cancellations, controversies, lawsuits, cultural shifts, the departure of its creators' active creative involvement, changes in voice casting, the deaths of beloved cast members, and the fundamental transformation of the television industry itself. Through all of it, the Griffins have remained on our screens, week after week, year after year, doing what they've always done, making us laugh, making us uncomfortable, and making us wonder what they'll possibly do next. Let's also dig into some specific episodes and moments that have left a permanent mark on television, because Family Guy's best work genuinely stands alongside the finest episodes of any animated comedy. The episode PTV from Season 4 is a perfect example of Family Guy at its sharpest. After the FCC begins cracking down on television content following a wardrobe malfunction during a TV broadcast, Peter starts his own television network from his basement, PTV, which has uncensored content without any government oversight. The episode featured the original song The Freaking FCC, which became one of the most popular musical numbers in the show's history. What made PTV work so well was that it was a genuine piece of social commentary dressed up as a comedy. The episode's critique of censorship and government regulation of entertainment was pointed and specific, referencing real events and real policies while still being laugh-out-loud funny. It aired during a period when the FCC was actually ramping up enforcement following the Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident, which gave the episode an urgency that elevated it beyond typical Family Guy fare. And then there were fewer. The Season 9 premiere took the show in a completely different direction by presenting a feature-length murder mystery. The hour-long episode gathered virtually every recurring character in the series at a dinner party hosted by James Woods, who had become a recurring antagonist. When characters started getting murdered one by one, the episode played out like an Agatha Christie mystery, complete with red herrings, dramatic reveals, and a body count that permanently removed several characters from the show's roster. The episode was visually ambitious, narratively complex, and tonally distinct from anything the show had done before. It demonstrated that Family Guy could sustain a serious story with genuine stakes while still incorporating its signature humor. The episode Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from Season 3 remains one of the most emotionally resonant installments the show has ever produced. The A-plot follows Brian as he's sentenced to community service and assigned to care for Pearl, a reclusive elderly woman who refuses to leave her house. What begins as a simple odd couple setup evolves into a genuinely moving story about connection, regret, and the fear of being forgotten. Pearl reveals that she was once a beautiful singer whose career was destroyed by a brutal critic, and she spent decades hiding from the world. Brian helps her rediscover the joy she thought she'd lost, and the episode ends with a sequence that's genuinely beautiful. The song "You Got a Lot to See," which accompanies a montage of Pearl experiencing the world she'd been hiding from, won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics. It's the kind of episode that makes you realize Family Guy is capable of real emotional depth when it chooses to be. The two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which served as the Season 5 finale and Season 6 premiere, was significant for how it handled the show's ongoing promise that Stewie would eventually follow through on his plans to kill his mother. The writers gave fans exactly what they had been waiting for, letting Stewie actually murder Lois and then take over the world. But the twist ending revealed that the entire scenario had been a simulation running on Stewie's computer. It was a clever way to give the audience the payoff they wanted while also freeing the show from having to actually follow through on such a dramatic change. The simulation ending allowed the writers to reset the status quo while also providing a logical reason for Stewie to abandon his world domination plans going forward, which opened the door for his character evolution into the more nuanced figure he would become in later seasons. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 was a meta-masterpiece that demonstrated Family Guy's ability to comment on its own evolution. Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the show's very first episode, and they're confronted with how different the show used to be. The animation is cruder, the humor is different, and the characters are drawn and voiced slightly differently than they are in the present. The episode explicitly acknowledges how much the show has changed over the years and uses the contrast for both comedy and surprisingly thoughtful commentary. When they accidentally alter the timeline and create a dystopian future, the episode becomes a meditation on the butterfly effect and the impossibility of recreating the past. It was the kind of self-aware storytelling that only a show with a decade of history could pull off. The influence of Family Guy on internet culture specifically deserves deeper exploration, because the show might be the most important animated series in the history of online fandom. Family Guy clips were among the first television content to go truly viral on early video sharing platforms. Before YouTube even existed, Family Guy scenes were being shared on message boards, early social media platforms, and file sharing networks. The cutaway gag format was perfectly suited to the clip-based nature of internet sharing. Each cutaway was essentially a self-contained comedy sketch that could be extracted from its episode and understood completely on its own. This meant that Family Guy content was endlessly shareable in a way that more plot-dependent shows couldn't match. The show's quote-heavy dialogue also made it a natural fit for internet culture. Phrases and running gags from the show became the building blocks of online humor communities, with fans memorizing and repeating lines in the same way that earlier generations had quoted Monty Python or The Princess Bride. The giggity catchphrase, Stewie's menacing delivery of the phrase "what the deuce," Peter's extended fights with the chicken, and countless other Family Guy elements became part of the shared vocabulary of internet humor. This gave the show a cultural reach that extended far beyond its actual viewership, with people who had never watched a full episode being familiar with its characters and catchphrases through second-hand exposure on social media. The show's relationship with meme culture became even more significant in the 2010s and 2020s. Family Guy screenshots and clips became some of the most commonly used templates for internet memes, with the show's exaggerated expressions and absurd situations providing versatile raw material for online comedy creators. The Peter Griffin hurt knee meme, various Stewie reaction images, and screenshots from cutaway gags have been reproposed millions of times across platforms like Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, and TikTok. This sustained presence in meme culture has helped keep Family Guy relevant with younger audiences who may never watch the show on broadcast television but who encounter its content daily on their phones. There's an argument to be made that Family Guy's cultural legacy will ultimately be defined more by its impact on internet culture than by its broadcast achievements. The show pioneered the kind of bite-sized, clip-friendly comedy that dominates online platforms today. Its cutaway format anticipated the short attention span, rapid-fire style of content that thrives on TikTok and Instagram Reels. Its willingness to reference anything and everything in pop culture prefigured the referential, heavily cross-pollinated nature of internet humor. In many ways, Family Guy was making internet comedy before the internet was ready for it, and when the platforms finally caught up, the show's content spread like wildfire. The animation industry as a whole has been shaped by Family Guy's success and failures in ways that extend well beyond the show itself. The revival of Family Guy in 2005 proved that there was a market for adult animated comedy beyond The Simpsons, which opened the door for an explosion of animated shows aimed at adults. Shows like Archer, Rick and Morty, Big Mouth, and countless others owe some debt to the audience that Family Guy helped cultivate. At the same time, Family Guy's more controversial tendencies have served as cautionary examples for newer shows, many of which have consciously distanced themselves from the shock humor approach that defined Family Guy's middle period. The longevity of Family Guy also raises interesting questions about the nature of comedy and cultural relevance. A joke that killed in 2003 doesn't necessarily land in 2025, and a show that started before social media existed now has to navigate a media landscape where any line of dialogue can be instantly amplified, decontextualized, and weaponized by people with very different perspectives on what's funny. Family Guy's evolution from boundary-pushing provocateur to established institution mirrors a broader cultural shift in how we think about comedy, its responsibilities, and its consequences. The show that once prided itself on offending everyone equally now exists in a world where everyone has a platform to explain exactly why they're offended and to organize collective action in response. Despite all of this, or perhaps because of all of this, Family Guy endures. It remains one of Fox's most valuable properties, one of the most recognizable animated series in the world, and one of the most discussed shows in television history. The Griffins have become as much a part of the American cultural landscape as any fictional family that has ever graced a television screen. They're flawed, they're offensive, they're occasionally brilliant, and they're not going anywhere. The story of Family Guy is ultimately a story about persistence, reinvention, and the unpredictable nature of success. It's about a kid who started drawing at age 2 and ended up creating one of the most successful entertainment franchises in history. It's about a show that was thrown away twice and came back stronger each time. It's about the thin line between genius and garbage, and how the best comedy often lives right on that line, wobbling back and forth with each new joke. And it's about the millions of fans around the world who have made the Griffin family a part of their lives, for better and for worse, for over a quarter century. If you made it this far, you're officially part of the Cartoon Codex family. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, drop a like on this video, and let us know in the comments what Family Guy fact surprised you the most. We've got tons more content coming about your favorite animated shows, so make sure those notifications are turned on. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.